death squads, coups, genocide. Is this what you think of when you hear the name Chiquita? Or maybe you think right to their bananas, stocked on every shelf. Maybe the other assortment of citrus fruits you could pick up. You may think there is no possibility that such a sweet, niche industry would carry power fantasies that would make the likes of Amazon blush. Yet, just a half century ago, whole governments collapsed. Hundreds of thousands were massacred. All to get that little banana on your counter. For as we peel back Chiquita's current mask, we find a century-long history of horrific crimes committed by one of the most vile companies to ever exist. Before I get into talking about all this, if you're interested just in what's in the title, skip to this time in the video. I'll be talking about a lot of history behind the region and the company beforehand to establish stuff up to that point, because some of it's pretty important to keep in mind, and some of it's also just goofy as fuck. Additionally, I do want to get into a bit of a content warning here. I don't go into super graphic description for much of the video, but during the section about the silent Holocaust, there will be some accounts that some may find disturbing. So please skip that section if you're uncomfortable hearing about the following. And finally, if there is something I get wrong or more information that could be potentially provided on a section, please do let me know. I'd be happy to state a correction if needed. The beginning of Chiquita started a very similar way people start questioning their neurodivergency. Choo-choos. Our story starts in 1871 with a man named Henry Meigs and his good old Twain business. Now, I know, it was my first thought when seeing the year 1871 too. But don't worry, we aren't starting on a bad note yet. Meigs wasn't a Confederate. He was a hard-working American businessman, alright? And so what if he committed a tiny bit of fraud? Who didn't back then? Okay, maybe a lot of fraud. Holy shit. So, Meigs may or may not have forged a lot of government documents during his time in California, then fled to South America half a decade before the Civil War with $9 million, which is around $350 million in today's money, by the way. He then built a bunch of roads in Chile, where I quote, Meigs constructed his bridges with masterly skill, and while he was building them, he studied the situation critically and profoundly, with a view to obtaining a contract to complete the road from Yeye to Santiago, a distance of 33 miles. The engineering difficulties were stupendous. There was a rise of 4,800 feet, huge masses of rock that seemed piled to the clouds, and wide and deep abysses yawned along the way. Every engineer that figured on that 33 miles estimated that it would cost over $27 million and would take 6 to 8 years to complete it, if indeed it could be built at all. After a thorough analysis of the work, Meigs offered to build the road from Yeye to Santiago for only $12 million, and to complete it in 4 years. Jesus, you think this dude had built the Burj Khalifa in Neolithic times the way this obituary hypes him up? Remember, this was about him engineering bridges. He then moved to Peru and started securing contracts there, and built infrastructure for a while, also handing out bribes to revolutionaries and government officials to try and control politics for his benefit. Until, eventually, his reputation, bankroll, and Peru's economy alongside it collapsed and he died. The obituary for Meigs stated, as Meigs had no moral sense himself, he continuously made the mistake of selecting unscrupulous men for his most intimate confederates. These men never hesitated to betray him when they imagined it to be their best interest to do so. He was absurdly generous. He had no sound business habits, nor was he guided by sound business principles. He would take the most reckless risks and trust to his audacity and his luck to bring him through. His career in Peru was a calamity to the country. The extravagance of living which he initiated and developed, the recklessness of expenditure to which he led the government, the unnatural expansion of trade which the disbursement of such vast sums of money occasioned, causing the financial crisis which came upon Peru in 1874, and under which she is still suffering. Man, this obituary was just sucking his dick with the bridges, but oh no, God forbid a man commit some bribery and plunge a country into widespread financial trouble. Man, this dude is like if some random billionaire, let's just say Elon Musk, no specific reason why, found himself into tons of money through various dubious means, and then used that money to buy himself power within the US government while slowly losing his stellar reputation over time and helping to contribute to an ongoing financial crisis. But that would be crazy, right? That would never take place nowadays. We haven't even gotten to Chiquita yet, and we've already got a lot of meddling in Latin American governments. So I guess it runs in the family, because our real main character behind Chiquita's start is Meeks' nephew, Minor C. Keith. Meeks had a contract building railroads in Costa Rica ongoing when he died in 1877, which Keith was already involved with since 1871, so he took over fully afterwards. The only problem is that Costa Rica's economy was primarily based on exporting beans. Coffee beans to be exact. While the price of coffee was strong through the 1870s, prices plummeted in 1881. Along with some good old printing money to cover the amount we don't have from the government caused the Costa Rican government to have a bit of a financial deadlock. To solve this, in 1884, the new Costa Rican president and Keith negotiated a debt settlement where Keith received roughly 800,000 acres on the coast, aka 6.25% of the country, for only 50% of the loan given, roughly $87 million worth of today's money. In American terms, this would be like if we gave China Texas to build a railroad across the country, and for $19 billion in total, about $110 per acre. And while this may seem like a lot, today the median cost per acre in Texas is roughly $4,600 for a total of $790 billion. He also gained control over the railroad and the port of Limon. While working on the railroad, Keith began experimenting with bananas, and when the railroad was completed but proved not enough to cover his debt, Keith decided to fully move into the banana industry with his tropical trading and transport company. With all of that fertile land along the coastline, Keith was able to build up his banana empire with multiple plantations, combined with easy shipping rates with his port and railroad access. By the late 19th century, banana exports began to rival coffee exports in Costa Rica, proving to be a very lucrative venture. In 1899, Keith merged his company with the Boston Fruit Company, another banana company with bases in Jamaica, to form the United Fruit Company, the true predecessor to Chiquita Banana. Certainly not the last time a United's to be universally hated, though. The next 30 years or so mainly involved United Fruit monopolizing the banana industry through corruption, racial policies, and massacres. But hey, at least no coups yet. Oh wait. Oh no. While United Fruit was doing their thing in the early 1900s, so was Samuel Zemurray. In 1903, he made an agreement with United Fruit to be able to sell any overripe bananas because United was just tossing them, I guess, expanding his network along the way. By 1910, with some help from United Fruit, Zemurray was able to purchase land in Honduras to start his own banana plantations, growing his company, Guatemala, to become a contender in the banana market. This, of course, didn't come without its fair share of political meddling. Honduran politics were quite turbulent at the time, with dictator Manuel Bonilla having recently been deposed in 1907 by a military junta supported by Nicaragua, with his former vice president, Miguel de Villa, being elected as the new president in 1908. Zemurray's interests in Honduras were already challenged by the Standard Fruit Company, now known as Dole, the third main competitor in the region, with significant grants being given to the company under former president Terencio Sierra, and Zemurray seeked to increase his influence over the country. In 1908, he helped fund a revolt supported by Guatemala and El Salvador against the president, although it collapsed before arbitration in the Central American courts concluded, and only drove the president to grant further concessions to Standard Fruit and US bankers to help with their debt issues. This led to Zemurray helping fund another revolt, this time headed by deposed dictator Bonilla, and being successful, with de Villa resigning in 1911, and Bonilla being re-elected in 1912, who then helped Zemurray avoid any financial burdens to the government. For the next 15 years or so, Zemurray and Guatemala were enjoying business as usual, with some small issues between Honduras and Guatemala that was really about their puppet masters in Guatemala and United, but nothing too interesting. After the stock market crash in 1929, however, Guatemala was completely bought out by United Fruit, making the two competitors one massive monopoly in the banana business. Zemurray became a member of the United Fruit board, and during the Depression bought a majority of the shares, naming himself CEO. Around the same time that all of Zemurray's fun was going on, and just before the sale of Guatemala, United Fruit also got embroiled in some human rights violations, to say the least. Workers were finally fed up with the horrendous working conditions, and in late 1928, a strike rose in Colombia. Actually, after reading everything, I think I'm gonna have to side with United on this one. I mean, how could be the workers be so greedy to demand something as insane as being paid in actual money and compensation for work accidents? I mean, that's crazy, come on now. Regardless, the Colombian government, incentivized to assist United Fruit to prevent economic problems, sent troops to quell the strike. After some tensions, the workers were eventually summoned to Ciénaga to settle the strike. But this gathering ended only with troops firing upon workers and their families, and after a few days of violence, left over 1,000 dead. The military chief in charge of the operation, as well as the government and United Fruit, all used some variations of classic excuses, including trying to prevent US invasions and calling the workers communists. All in all, this was just the first 1,000 of many more deaths that would be on United Fruit's hands. So just to recap, we now have the person who funded 2 coups in Honduras, running the company that was just involved in the massacre of 1,000 of its workers, founded by a guy who built his company off essentially scamming Costa Rica and receiving a lot of political blackmail, who got his start from his uncle who made his money from a ton of massive fraud and lots more political blackmail, and also being a bit of a dictator in Peru. And we're not even to the heavy part of Chiquita's history. Great start. Over the next decade and a half or so, more worker strikes and reforms were passed against United Fruit, with the company trying to prevent changes as much as they could, suppressing strikes and violating laws at every turn. But at least this one in Costa Rica led to some pretty cool changes. Eventually, however, Zemurray would fight back against reforms similar to how he had done in Honduras, to far worse consequences though. Of all the Latin American countries impacted by United Fruit, Guatemala has probably suffered the most resulting from their actions. Up until the 1940s, Guatemala's government continued the Latin American tradition of granting United Fruit concessions to let them increase their power. As a result, United Fruit had a heavy hand in maintaining Guatemala's power structure, especially in the reign of a dictator elected in 1931 by the name of Jorge Ubico. During his rule, United Fruit gained control of 42% of Guatemala's total land. Jesus fucking Christ. And had monetary exemptions on top of everything. During his rule, the first glimpses of suppression of the native Mayan people caused by United Fruit's hand in particular truly appear. Ubico implemented forced labor laws and killed hundreds on forced marches through the jungles, while keeping his country purposely impoverished and unable to even afford food prices. Man, allowing corporate interests to keep going, but making it so that the average person can barely afford food prices? Where have I heard that one before? But who can blame United? I mean, who wouldn't want to prop up someone who, when addressing a massacre of potential revolutionaries, said, and I quote, "I am like Hitler, I execute first and give trial afterwards." In 1944, he was finally ousted, and what is considered to be the first fair election was conducted during the Guatemalan Revolution. The next 2 presidencies had an extremely positive impact on Guatemala, with social, educational, and health reforms being passed, modeled similarly after FDR's New Deal, starting with President Juan José Arevalo. However, Guatemala's second president in this period, Jacobo Arbenz, made a grave mistake. He came after United Fruit's bananas. The revolutionary government had already earned ire from the US government after letting communists participate in elections, legalizing unions, guaranteeing labor protections, and supporting a group committed to overthrowing dictatorships in Central America. All this is horrifying, I know. On a side note, Jesus Christ, reading the CIA report from 1949 is so funny on the Caribbean League. They keep trying to imply countries like Nicaragua weren't dictatorships, meanwhile this is the Wikipedia for this time period. But the passing of Decree 900 was the straw that finally broke the camel's back. Decree 900 aimed to solve the economic divide between Guatemala's rich and poor, specifically amongst farmers. A mere 2% of the population controlled more than 72% of Guatemala's arable land. Of all privately held land, less than 12% was being cultivated. In a country dedicated primarily to agriculture, this translated into sweeping poverty and malnutrition. With that level of landholding disparity, especially with only 12% being in use, it seems logical to encourage some redistribution of those lands. United Fruit was especially guilty of this, as of the 40-some% of Guatemalan land they held, only 8% of their land, or about 3% of Guatemala's total land, was being used. Currently, around 10% of housing in the US is vacant while we're in a housing crisis, so imagine if that housing crisis is even worse because now it's a poverty crisis as well. And instead of 10% vacancies, it's 4 times that amount, held by only one company. In fact, to really hammer this in, let's go back to our US example from earlier. So, of the entire US, United Fruit would have owned about this much. And of that, only about New Mexico would be being used. So, the Guatemalan government seized about 40% of United Fruit's land, which by the way still leaves around 52% of the land they held uncultivated, while benefiting somewhere around 100,000 poor rural families, who would actually put that land to use. For our US map, that would be roughly like taking these states back, while still keeping everything else here. Bonds were also given as compensation for the seized land based on the land value seized. Although, interestingly enough, apparently United Fruit kind of shot themselves in the foot here, since they underreported the value by millions for tax purposes, so that value is what they got compensated for, although they tried to argue that they deserved more. Well, what happens when you have a few rich, highly conservative elites, a banana company ticked off, and a communist panicked US with a president elected on the promise of cracking down on communism more? You get Operation PB Success, a successful US-backed coup in 1954. Several of Eisenhower's staff members had close connections to United Fruit, which definitely influenced the decision as well, although it probably would have gone through regardless considering Truman had authorized a coup that was abandoned in 1952, and the CIA panic over Guatemala's leftist rise was very apparent. Not to mention, Zemurray, the dude that started the coup in Honduras 40 years earlier, was also involved in this coup, contributing to propaganda efforts against the Guatemalan government. Now, although United Fruit had some underhanded influence in Guatemala going forward, as well as some more stuff I'll talk about later, this is where their story in Guatemala kind of ends. So why do I blame them for the horrors that took place later? Well, the revolutionary government was really the last time Guatemala had a truly upwards trajectory in their government, really until the 21st century. A decade of progress and potential prosperity undid by the greed and the paranoia of a few. Arbenz was forced to resign, and in his place, the man the US personally chose to replace him, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. This dude had participated in 3 coups previously, one being the original 1944 one to get rid of Ubico, and 2 failed ones after the revolution started. So, you know how it is, 4th time's a charm. His regime was pretty short, honestly. The Guatemalan people were pretty displeased with his takeover, but couldn't really do anything because of the army suppression. And he kind of just did the normal dictator thing of rounding up random people, accusing them of being commies, and held them in prison with no due process, plus also rolling back the land reforms to make United Fruit happy. He was assassinated 3 years into his rule after struggling with debt, after falling export prices, and a period of civil war soon began surrounding the continuous US-backed autocrats who assumed control. After Armas' death, elections were held in 1957. Miguel Ortiz Pasarelli was elected, however, supporters of the runner-up Miguel Ydígoras Fuentes rioted in the capital, causing the results to be suspended just 6 days after the election, and a new election was held in 1958. In this next election, Ydígoras was elected. Ydígoras notably had actually run previously as a primary contender to Arbenz during the 1950 election, as well as previously served under Ubico's government. No wonder he lost that election. He was also a notorious coup artist like Armas during the revolutionary period, and was another choice for the 1954 coup, but was decided against due to his ties to Ubico. He pretty much pissed off everyone during his time in power. He tended to be conciliatory with the left wing, passing weak lane reforms, and even saying he'd let Arevalo return to Guatemala and run in the next election, but at the same time didn't pass any proper economic reforms to keep the country afloat, had rampant corruption during his presidency, and allowed the training of Cuban rebels for the Bay of Pigs invasion to be held in Guatemala. This all culminated in left-wing rebels rising up in Guatemala and the conservative base in the country declaring his government to be sympathetic to communism, especially knowing Arevalo would have definitely won any fair election he participated in. That last part also isn't just my opinion, the CIA certainly thought so too. He was deposed finally by a coup in 1963 after a number of failed coups previously, and replaced by his defense minister, Enrique Peralta Azurdia. The most significant part of his presidency, however, besides the continued division between the elite and the left, was the eruption of leftist guerrilla groups. In 1960, a group of leftist military officer cadets led a failed revolution against Ydígoras, fleeing to the mountains and jungles. This uprising marked the official start to the Guatemalan Civil War and led to decades of fighting between leftist guerrillas and the US-backed Guatemalan government. There was a number of insurgent groups that rose up during the mid-20th century. Prominent ones that come to mind are the IRA in the British Isles or the ETA in Basque County. Terrorism and counter-terrorist efforts from governments is fairly well documented, and for the most part, most successful counterinsurgency measures involve a conciliatory approach towards the disaffected populations. Guerrilla groups thrive off their base of support, and without it, they crumble. This is exhibited especially with the ETA, as the group continued aggressive actions harming civilians or taking unnecessary brutalities, while the government moved away from suppressive counterterrorism efforts, causing the group's support to collapse in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. Guatemala's government, on the other hand, decided to take a much different approach to that of appealing to the civilian base, more along the lines of the common tactic of the time, which was to suppress any suspected insurgents and disregard all due process to imprison masses. And they turned that dial up to 11. This period of Guatemala's history is horrifically brutal, to the point where a CIA memo from 1972 stated, "Sophisticated political discernment has never been a strong point in Guatemala, and the anti-communist campaign resulted in more dead bodies than the Communist Party had members. Some victims were innocent bystanders. Some others were the personal and political enemies of the jefes of law and order forces." Notably, this early period of leftist insurgency was primarily composed of and supported by Ladino people in Guatemala, a demographic that made over just half of the population. The indigenous Mayan people, who primarily made up the poorer rural class, the traditional basis for guerrilla groups, were more apathetic to the general civil war. The Mayan people had been mostly neglected by government policy in Guatemala to this point, and suffered most via the growing wealth disparity. Even under reforms like Decree 900, meant to support the rural population, Ladinos benefited disproportionately, with 81% of beneficiaries being Ladino. This, combined with no real promise of change or connection between the insurgents and the indigenous people, left the insurgency fairly devoid of local support until the 1970s. During the 60s, the group additionally faced issues internally regarding the use of violence, as well as philosophy changes from the Sino-Soviet split post-Khrushchev. Regardless, there was some modicum of success in rural disruption with help from the Cubans, while counter-revolutionary efforts in urban areas proved to be more successful. These counter-revolutionary measures, however, were often brutal, as even the official CEH report created to investigate the genocide states repression as a substitution for law was the government's motive. As a side note, I highly suggest reading through the CEH report if you're interested more in this period. In the 60s, there's not a whole lot of information on direct counterinsurgency efforts from the government, or the guerrilla groups specifically, as a lot of Human Rights Watch reports focus more on the decolonization in Africa and Asia, but notably the targets seem to be more widespread, targeting mainly urban areas. Additionally, in the late 60s, the government had a civilian president, so counterinsurgency was mainly through the loosely connected death squads. This shifted in the early 70s as the government moved more to the rural base, coinciding with the shift in insurgent philosophy to gain the support of the rural Mayans, as well as a return of military command to the government in 1970. Additionally, guerrilla attacks were fairly minimal in the early 1960s, largely due to the ideological infighting, only picking up larger-scale attacks for public attention in the late 1960s, provoking a larger government response. While there aren't a ton of good independent records on the time, probably the first time anyone's ever said this, but thank God for the CIA, because there are records of state terror being utilized in the form of death squads thanks to good old CIA record keeping. These death squads were specially trained far-right forces, acting under loose supervision from the government and often trained by United States Special Forces, notably the Green Berets and CIA. These groups often carried out massacres and were used as scare tactics throughout Latin America, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians who were suspected communists extrajudicially. The most prominent of these groups during the 60s and early 70s was the US-backed Mano Blanca, or White Hand, a group set up as a front for the MLN, which was the party set up by our favorite usurper Armas. Its leader, who participated in the coup that installed Armas, was reportedly captured and tortured by leftists, who now equated anyone who didn't share his radical anti-communist beliefs with his torturers. This group in particular was known for leaving a white glove or handprint near or on a victim's body. The government tried to claim the group and other death squads were independent insurgents. However, this was widely disputed even at the time and was only proven patently false as documents became declassified. In just the first year after their creation, the group, along with other death squads at the time, had killed an estimated 3,000 people, with around 8,000 in total being killed by just the White Hand in the 60s. An interesting development in the country is the shift away from Catholicism, as the church in Guatemala often advocated for the lower class, causing the right wing to associate them alongside communist insurgents, in great contrast to most other communist insurgencies at the time. This led to church officials becoming additional targets for death squads, such as when Mano Blanca kidnapped an archbishop in 1958, although he was released when the government refused to meet demands. The change in support base for insurgents, and therefore the targets for the government and death squads, continued in the early to mid-70s as the Catholic Church in Guatemala and the Mayan indigenous people became increasingly sympathetic to the insurgents. The Catholic Church continued to be a source of support for the poor and struggling, and a record-keeping source for human rights abuses. Meanwhile, Mayan migration towards urban areas established a sentiment to maintain Mayan culture, as well as anti-government sentiments forming as a result of rural crackdowns to suppress rebel sentiment from the government. From 1970 until 1978, there was a transition of violence more towards the rural support base from counterinsurgents and death squads, as official policy moved to assassinating higher-level leaders and major insurgent groups, and selective terror amongst the rural bases. Leadership amongst the insurgent movements was additionally turbulent in the early 1970s. Meanwhile, the government moved to effectively a one-party state, with the same party ruling from 1970 until 1982. One of the foremost politicians of this party was Mario Sandoval Alarcon, who served as the leader of Congress from 70 to 74 and vice president from 74 to 78. He was also almost elected president twice in the 80s. But perhaps the wildest part about this man is that he's held such prominent roles when he was the founder of the White Hand. Yeah, that should give an idea of Guatemalan politics at the time, as there was an immense amount of political liquidation and general corruption going on during the Civil War period. An earthquake in 1976 caused a stark increase in insurgent sentiment. The earthquake killed around 20,000 people and displaced around 1 million, mainly affecting rural areas in the highlands. The government did little to alleviate the victims of the earthquake, causing many Mayans to turn to the insurgency. As a side note, what were the CIA on, man? Quote, "This process is producing a less submissive generation of Indians," unquote, was unironically a quote from this report. Rural areas by this point were so highly neglected by the current government, it's incredibly unsurprising support for insurgents grew. Illiteracy rates in rural areas were up to 80%, unemployment at 30%, 80% of children under 5 were affected by malnutrition, and these rates were only expected to rise. Human rights conditions were so bad, even the US government under Jimmy Carter finally did something, cutting aid to Guatemala completely, although technically this was only direct aid. The government attempted to pass reforms to alleviate conditions during this time, but plans were often ineffective and undermined by the private sector and more conservative politicians. Indeed, these groups favored repression heavily, which increased starkly in 1978 with the election of Fernando Romeo Lucas Garcia. Before he could even take office, tragedy struck under the previous government's orders. In May 1978, 200 Kekchi Mayans marched to the village square in Panzos to demand their land rights be respected, as for over a decade their land had been confiscated by the government and the wealthy. When they arrived, the army was waiting, certainly encouraged by the oil conglomerates working in the region, and opened fire on the crowd. As Marlise Simmons of the Washington Post wrote, "It took just a few minutes of solid, frenzied gunfire for the Guatemalan army to clear the village square at Panzos. When the shooting stopped, bodies of children, women, and men lay bleeding among the trees. Anywhere from 100 to 140 people were killed in the horrific event, but it marked a clear start of free speech suppression as the government cracked down on any protests to government decisions." In just the first 6 months of Lucas Garcia's regime, over 500 victims of right-wing violence have been found, marking somewhere between 20,000 to 50,000 sanctioned disappearances or killings since 1966. In October, a labor protest ended with police violently restraining the crowd, arresting over 1,000, wounding 300, and killing 40. Death squads became emboldened as well, as one death squad, the ESA, published a list of members of the public that they had tried and sentenced to death. Just 2 days later, one of those listed, Oliverio Castañeda, president of the San Carlos University Students Association, was killed at just the age of 23 when 5 cars carrying men armed with machine guns gunned him down in the street in the center of the capital, within sight of a police detachment and the National Palace. Moments before his death, Mr. Castañeda told a large public rally in support of the transport workers' strike that 80,000 Guatemalans had died since 1962 as a result of political violence. Several other student leaders during this time were either gunned down or disappeared, simply for speaking out. Violence against the Mayan population also increased further, the army seeking to exploit ethnic tensions to break down Mayan cultural cohesion. On January 31st, 1980, Mayan protesters entered the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City after having been protesting the killing and disappearing of peasants the last few days. Spain, seen as sympathetic to the cause, was looking to negotiate a peaceful resolution via their ambassadors. Instead, police began an assault on the building, violating international law, with the assault ending with the burning of the building. All but two of the demonstrators and embassy staff were killed, with one of the survivors, a demonstrator, later being kidnapped from the hospital, tortured, and executed. The last remaining survivor, the Spanish ambassador, was able to escape and flee the country after his life was threatened in the note left after the previous execution. The police chief at the time was eventually tried and convicted for his role in the massacre in 2015, as well as for two other extrajudicial killings that occurred after this, and was sentenced to 90 years in prison. An estimated 20 to 30 people were being killed every day in 1979, and this only increased from 30 to 40 in 1980, with an estimated 5,000 people killed for solely political reasons in 1980. From 1978 to 1982, the government killed up to an estimated 50,000 people, with the targets largely being indigenous Mayans. Furthermore, between 1981 and 1983, the government identified the Mayan people as quote-unquote the internal enemy, as indigenous support for insurgents grew dramatically to hundreds of thousands of supporters. Thus, between these years, government-sanctioned massacres against the population were committed, largely aiming to kill the largest groups possible. In the Ixil region alone, an estimated 70 to 90% of villages were razed, leaving communities decimated. Between 1980 and 1982, the Rio Negro village, which is located in the same region as Panzos, suffered a number of attacks. One survivor stated, "They illegally captured the men. They tortured them. They used weapons to kill, rape, and exterminate communities." This same man was kidnapped, tortured, and enslaved by a government patrolman, a man who killed his entire family in front of him, and was later sentenced to death for his role in the attacks, although his sentence was later reduced to only 30 years. The victim stated he watched as the patrolman wrapped a rope around his brother's neck, smashed him into the stones, and he threw his body in the creek, the same way he killed the other children. The army used scorched earth tactics to ensure the complete decimation of communities. The Rio Negro massacres and the massacres in nearby Plan de Sanchez ended with the death of over half of the native Mayan Achi people, roughly 450 of the near 800 inhabitants. The Plan de Sanchez massacre occurred in July of 1982, where the village was targeted as part of genocidal policy from the government, using the same scorched earth tactics seen in Rio Negro from the past 2 years. This increase in scorched earth tactics aligned significantly with the coup that took place in March of 1982, installing Efrain Rios Montt as de facto president. If Lucas Garcia's regime saw a significant increase in killings, from around 100 to 10,000 per year, Rios Montt's inhumanity reached even further. During his only 18-month regime, he killed thousands, displaced over 1 million, and destroyed up to 440 villages, during his campaign to, quote-unquote, dry up the human sea in which the gorilla fish swim. Inhabitants were raped, tortured, murdered. If the army encountered any resistance from villages, the entire village was to be destroyed. If a village was found empty, it was assumed to be collaborating with rebels and razed. The army forced Ixil natives to fight for the government in exchange for basic commodities just to survive. The army treated insurgents and civilians the same, with no remorse. In December 1982, a detachment of the Caibals, the Guatemalan special forces trained by the Green Berets, entered the village of Dos Eres. Quote, upon their incursion, the villagers were subjected to torture and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Several women, including girls and teenagers, were raped repeatedly. The children were brutally beaten, and many of them were thrown down a well that was still under construction. The remaining villagers were also executed, their remains thrown down the well. Unquote. In total, an estimated 250 people were massacred in the brutality. During Mont's regime, the average number of people killed per massacre increased from an estimated 37 under Lucas Garcia to 45 under Rios Montt, across a combined roughly 80 massacres from 1981 to 1983 in just the Ixil area. In total, roughly 630 massacres were committed by the government through the early 1980s against the Mayan populace. Now, mind you, this was all known to the government at the time in the US. The public even caught wind of some of this information, as mentioned with the previous reporting of Banzos by the Washington Post, and the removed aid during Carter's presidency. When Reagan took office in 1980, however, the government just decided, we love genocide now, I guess. Reagan immediately resumed funding of Guatemala, including military equipment being sold. This was especially true during the Rios Montt regime, as even though Guatemala was suffering through the worst human rights abuses ever under his rule, Reagan in 1982 stated that President Rios Montt is a man of great personal integrity and commitment, that Montt wants to improve the quality of life for all Guatemalans and to promote social justice, and that Reagan's administration will do all it can to support his progressive efforts. Additionally, U.S. diplomats would dismiss reports of massacres as communist disinformation campaigns, and the State Department reported significant advances to human rights under the regime. After Rios Montt was overthrown in 1983, human rights violations and mass killing slowed, but did not stop. Indeed, by 1990, at least 100,000 were killed, with at least 40,000 disappeared, as the Civil War raged on until 1996 when peace accords were finally signed. This is even during a downturn of insurgent activity, as the last real era of momentum for insurgent recruiting coincided with Lucas Garcia's crackdown in 79 to 82. Attempts were made in the 90s to prosecute human rights abusers during the 80s. However, after amnesty agreements under the previous administration, corruption, and threats from death squads, this was put off on hold until the late 90s, going into the 2000s. In total, between 200,000 and 250,000 people were murdered or went missing during the Guatemalan Civil War, most occurring during the Lucas Garcia and Rios Montt regimes, where 91% of human rights violations occurred. Out of the hundreds of thousands murdered, roughly 83% were indigenous Mayans. Of all the human rights abuses committed during the conflict, approximately 93% were committed by the government compared to guerrilla groups. Only one true pattern emerged, as the CEH report states, victims included men, women, and children of all social strata. Workers, professionals, church members, politicians, peasants, students, and academics. In ethnic terms, the vast majority are Mayans. Civilian women suffered horrifically throughout the conflict as well. Quote, the CEH investigation has revealed that approximately a quarter of the direct victims of human rights violations and active violence were on women. They were killed, tortured, and raped, sometimes because of their ideals and political or social participation, sometimes in massacres or other indiscriminate actions. Unquote. Often the survivors were left with no materials to make a living and feed the remnants of their families left over from the massacres due to the scorched earth policies. Thankfully, there has been some justice for families who suffered through the genocide. Numerous leaders who ordered the atrocities and soldiers who participated in them have been sentenced for human rights abuses, albeit the sentence is sometimes much less than they should be. Unfortunately, the two biggest perpetuators of the genocide never saw the prison time they deserved. Lucas Garcia died in 2006 before he could be tried, and due to Venezuela desiring his extradition because of his health. And although Rios Montt was convicted in 2013, his conviction was overturned on procedural issues, and before his next trial can conclude, he died in 2018. It's sickening that these two monsters were able to live full lives, while hundreds of thousands suffered under their rule. Even worse, Rios Montt was able to have a full political career after, serving in Congress from 94 to 96 and 2000 to 03, even running for the presidency, although thankfully unsuccessfully. Although it was important to cover the section in Guatemala's history relating to the United Fruit setup, they weren't involved after setting this all in motion, much beyond some guerrilla attacks on United Fruit offices early in the war. So, what was going on with our favorite Latin American destabilizer during this time? Well, in the 50s and 60s, labor strikes were popping up everywhere in Latin American nations against United Fruit, with Honduras being a leading figure. At least this time, instead of overthrowing the government, agreements began being met to grant concessions to workers for better labor conditions. In 1970, United Fruit merged with AMK Corporation to form United Brands, with Eli Black as their CEO. However, United Brands soon experienced massive losses, followed by massive taxes levied by Central American countries in 1974, as well as a hurricane that sent the company back $20 million, roughly $130 million today. Black sold the company the following year after $70 million in operating losses in 1974, committing suicide in early 1975. An investigation into his death turned up a bribery scandal, quite hilariously known as Bananagate, where the SEC uncovered bribes to Central American and European officials, causing charges to be brought up against the company and a coup in Honduras, as the president was named in the case. Man, even unintentionally, Chiquita was still starting coups in the Caribbean basin. What's even crazier is they got the maximum punishment after pleading guilty in 1978, which, take a guess, was how much? You probably guessed wrong, it's only $15,000, which is less than $60,000 today. In 1984, United Brands finally went through another change, finally becoming the company we know today, Chiquita Brands International. In the 1990s, Chiquita started the Banana War, a trade conflict between the United States and Europe, which was the worst transatlantic trade conflict since World War II, at least until recently. This conflict eventually forced Chiquita to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy back in 2001 after the market loss in Europe. Now, you'd think Guatemala was the last time Chiquita would be involved in Latin American death squads, but just last year, Chiquita was ordered to pay millions in restitution to victims of Colombian death squads Chiquita funded, being found liable for the deaths of 8 people. Between 1997 and 2004, Chiquita was found to have paid $1.7 million to paramilitaries in Colombia, pleading guilty in 2007 to funding a terrorist group. Chiquita tried to plead that they were victims of extortion. However, the Chiquita papers that were subpoenaed and later published showed Chiquita as a willing participant in the funding of death squads. A telling excerpt from a document dated May 7, 1997, states the payments were the, quote, cost of doing business in Colombia. Maybe the question is not why we are doing this, but rather, we are in Colombia and do we want to ship bananas from Colombia, unquote. And that Chiquita, quote, need to keep this very confidential. People can get killed, unquote. As Earth Rights International stated, quote, this ruling marks the first time that an American jury has held a major U.S. corporation liable for complicity in serious human rights abuses in another country, a milestone for justice, unquote. Chiquita's brand history is marred by a dark past of corruption, coups, human rights abuses, and monopolistic practices. Chiquita firmly takes its place as one of the worst companies to ever exist, as its actions have directly caused the destabilizing of several countries, the deaths of hundreds of thousands, and the displacement of millions. Thank you all for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you have any mention of additional info or corrections, please do let me know. I also stream nearly every night on Twitch, so please check me out if you're interested in hearing me yap in game. I do want to address that all my previous content has been rival spids, but honestly, I always kind of intended on making more general content like this kind of thing. I don't plan on making more of these specific kind of vids, talking about some dark topic, unless it's like on a strange premise. Something like maybe the bird wars in China and Australia, or the filibuster war, or really anything that went on in the mid-1800s in Latin America, because so much of it is kind of goofy. I do still plan on making more gaming videos. I just kind of got bored of Rivals. Been doing a lot of Monster Hunter and Siege lately, so we'll see what ends up happening. Let me know if you have any suggestions though, and until next time.